Manoj Dada, are you ready?
It's starting up. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a go.
नमस्कार मंडळी. मी नमिता वेदक, महाराष्ट्र मंडळ शिकागोची अध्यक्ष. तुम्हा सर्वांचं इतिहास मंचाच्या आजच्या सत्रावर स्वागत. हा आपला पार्ट 2 आहे पानिपतच्या प्रेझेंटेशनचा. आणि आपले गेस्ट जे आहेत रोहन ठाणेदार ह्यांचं पण आपल्या इतिहास मंचावर स्वागत. वेलकम रोहन. आणि त्याचबरोबर आपले जे श्रोते आहेत जे ह्या मंचावर आज आलेले आहेत त्यांना वेलकम. त्यांची फ्रायडे संध्याकाळ ते आपल्याबरोबर ह्या मस्त प्रेझेंटेशन साठी आलेले आहेत, ते बघायला आणि ऐकायला. तर थँक्यू व्हेरी मच. आणि ह्याचबरोबर आत्ता आपला जो विकेंडला मागच्या शनिवारी झालेला प्रोग्राम, आपल्या मंडळाचा दिवाळी प्रोग्राम सण गोंधळ, तो फारच धमाकेदार झाला. आणि आपल्या ह्याच्यामधल्याच पुष्कळशा प्रेक्षकांनी, जे श्रोते जे आहेत त्यांनी तिकडे पार्टिसिपेशन केलं. 90+ लोकांना घेऊन आपण एक मस्त प्रोग्राम, लोकल प्रोग्राम केला. आणि टॅलेंटेड आर्टिस्ट त्याच्यामध्ये होते, आपले सिंगर्स, डान्सर्स आणि स्किट्स. आणि जो मस्त प्रोग्राम झाला त्याच्यासाठी आणि तुम्ही जो प्रतिसाद दिलात, येऊन सपोर्ट करून, पार्टिसिपेट करून, त्या सगळ्यांना मनपूर्वक आभार. तुमच्यामुळे हा आमचा प्रोग्राम फारच सुंदर झाला. ते 375 पीपल इन अटेंडन्स. संध्याकाळचा आपल्या इकडे शिकागोमध्ये काळोखातला काळोख लवकर होतो, त्यात तो लक्षात ठेवूनही तुम्ही वेळेवर प्रोग्रामला आलात. आपला प्रोग्राम वेळेवर संपला आणि तुम्ही जो वन्स मोरच्या टाळ्यांनी आम्हाला जो प्रतिसाद दिलात त्याच्यासाठी वन्स मोर थँक्यू. आपले त्यातलेच आपले चेतन रेगे, आपल्या ह्याच्या मंचाचे जे ऍडमिन्स आहेत, त्यांनी आणि त्यांच्या बरोबरच्या आपल्या काही मुलांनी जो शिवगर्जनेने जो प्रोग्रामची हे केली, सांगता केली, त्याच्यामध्ये फारच मजा आली. आणि तो लहान मुलगा किंवा चेतनचा जो लहान मुलगा आहे राम, त्यांनी केलेले नृत्य किंवा शिवगर्जना वगैरे सगळं फारच सुंदर सुंदर झाला आपला प्रोग्राम. तर परत सगळ्यांचे थँक्यू, चेतनचे थँक्यू, आणि ह्याच्यावरती असलेले ब्रिजन आणि अजून पुष्कळ लोक आहेत ज्यांचे मी नावं आता सगळ्यांचे काय घेत नाहीये. पण तुम्हाला सगळ्यांना थँक्यू, तुम्ही त्याच्यात पार्टिसिपेट करून त्या प्रोग्राममध्ये 4 चांद लावलेत, त्याच्यासाठी थँक्स. आणि आता स्टार्ट द प्रोग्राम. ह्याचबरोबर एक आठवण करून देते, आपल्या ह्या रविवारी अर्थविचार चा आपला जो कट्टा आहे, त्या कट्ट्याचा इन पर्सन लाईव्ह प्रोग्राम होणार आहे शामबाग लायब्ररीमध्ये सकाळी दुपारी 12:30 वाजता, रविवारी 23 नोव्हेंबर. तर पार्टिसिपेशन्स आर लिमिटेड. तर मोस्ट ऑफ द सीट्स आर ऑलरेडी फिल्ड अप. 10 सीट्स अजून बाकी आहेत. जर नसेल पार्टिसिपेट म्हणजे रजिस्टर केलं तर प्लीज रजिस्टर. शामबाग लायब्ररीमध्ये रॅस्मुसन हॉलमध्ये असणार आहे 12:30 वाजता. आणि उद्या सकाळी आपला आरोग्यधामच्या कट्ट्याच्या तर्फे एक कॅन्सर सर्वायव्हर हे पेशंट आहेत, जे त्यांना दिले होते फक्त 2 महिने त्यांच्या ऑन्कॉलॉजिस्टनी. त्याच्यामध्ये त्यांनी डिसाईड केलं की व्हॉट इज देअर टू लूज. मी एक नॅचरल हे करून बघतो. त्यांनी त्याच्यामध्ये त्यांचे डाएट चेंजेस केले, लाईफस्टाईल चेंजेस, योगा, मेडिटेशन, जे काय पॉसिबल त्यांना वाटलं वुड हेल्प हिम improve his life. He did that and he is in year number 5 right now and still healthy and strong going on. तर ते त्यांची त्यांनी काय काय केलं हे त्याच्याबद्दल सांगणार आहेत. आणि आपल्याला त्याच्यातून नक्कीच थोडे काही टिप्स मिळतील. नॉट नेसेसरी की आपल्याला विल नीड टू, बट यू नेव्हर नो वेन यू माइट नीड ऑल दोज टेक्निक्स. अँड त्यांची जी सर्वायव्हरशिपची गोष्ट आहे, होप्सची त्यांची गोष्ट आहे. आणि ही स्टील फॉलोइंग हिमसेल्फ विथ अन ऑन्कॉलॉजिस्ट. सो इट्स नॉट लाईक ही इज गिव्हन अप. तर ते तुम्ही लोक ज्यांना माहित नसेल तर नक्की अटेंड करा. आपला आरोग्यधाम कट्टा उद्या सकाळी 9 वाजता. This being said, let us start with today's presentation. Chetan, over to you. Thank you.
थँक्यू. नमस्कार सगळ्यांना. नमस्ते. सर्व इतिहास मंचाचे आपले सर्व श्रोते सगळ्यांचं मनापासून स्वागत करतो. मी चेतन रेगे. नमिताताई, खूप धन्यवाद. अगदी गोड शब्दामध्ये आज तुम्ही सगळ्यांची स्तुती केली आणि खरं तर त्या तुमच्या नेतृत्वामध्ये हा कार्यक्रम सुंदर झाला आपला सण कोंदणचा, आणि शाळेतल्या पण अनेक मुलांनी वगैरे सगळ्यांनी पार्टिसिपेट केलं. सो त्या सगळ्यांना एक छान आनंदाचा अनुभव मिळाला. तर त्याबद्दल खरंच धन्यवाद. विशेष थँक्यू आज मनोज दादा, मनोज भट. तर त्यांनी अगदी शॉर्ट नोटीसवरती आपल्याला यूट्यूब लाईव्ह केलेलं आहे. सो व्हेरी थँक्यू मच. तर त्याच्यासाठी आणि मनापासून स्वागत आज प्रमोद ठाणेदार आणि मिसेस ठाणेदार आपलं इतिहास मंचावरती आहे. आणि वी हॅव अ फाईन यंग मॅन हू इज अ ग्रँड स्पीकर अँड व्हेरी मच बिलवेड ॲक्च्युली. कारण मला फार मजा येते दरवेळेला रोहनशी जेव्हा जेव्हा मी बोलतो, तेव्हा आय रिली फाइंड व्हेरी वेल रिसर्च्ड अँड रिफाइंड researcher in history, and he takes a serious interest into very complicated part of history, which is very praiseworthy, and such a fine job you two did on him. So thank you so much for that. इतिहासाच्या बाबतीमध्ये पानिपत वन ऑफ द ग्रेटेस्ट बॅटल इन वर्ल्ड हिस्ट्री इतकं म्हणता येईल. आणि आपल्या सगळ्या मराठी फॅमिलीजमध्ये वी ॲटलिस्ट one person has died in the past in this battle. It is said that एवढं सगळ्या मराठी फॅमिलीजचं कॉन्ट्रीब्युशन आहे टू प्रोटेक्ट इंडिया. The battle was very much of a historic importance, and to regain the stability and control among all the Hindus and native people, which was very paramount importance at that time. And the Marathas have actually shown the leadership when it was due and when it was essential. So it's a heroic story, and it has a lot of uh, petals over this beautiful story, actually. So Panipat, which basically has a big beginning from the Hinduvi Swarajya Foundation by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. And when we all know that after Aurangzeb, the India became a fragile land. It was controlled by several subedars and in the Mughal kingdom, and Maratha Confederacy, basically under leadership of Chhatrapati Shahu and Peshwas, found this great opportunity to rise and expand, and not just to territorially expanding. It was to control and stabilize the land and regain all the rightful ownership of the country. So Panipat is that midpoint where Maratha saw they were at the zenith. They were hardly losing any battles at that time. So Panipat is that deciding pivotal point in even Maratha history too. So that is a grand story of Panipat, and what we saw in part one was the background story of Panipat. And today we are actually going to visit the next details of the battle and actual what we have in the contemporary documents, and as well as like how the battle was there. So very well received speech last week. Rohan, I wanted to introduce basically this Itihas Manch admins. First, Chetan Rege, Madhav Dada Gogavle, Vishal Navalkar, Vaishnavi Navalkar, Prajakta Joshi, who made excellent flyer. And this time I actually really want to mention Prajakta, this second flyer that was requested for the changes. She did it in 60 seconds. When I sent the request, hey, we are changing the date, and can you please update this? And within 60 seconds, Prajakta responded with a flyer. And I was so surprised. I was like, you should be charged with a speeding ticket because it's not legal. That's what I said to her. So thank you, Prajakta, for such a prompt service. And also, of course, Namita Tai. And I wanted to introduce briefly Rohan and Pramodji. Rohan is a software engineer specializing in connected vehicles at the Ford Motor Company. He lives in Chicago and has become a fan of studying all world history, but especially Maratha history. For the last 6 years, he has been learning Marathi language and is proud to speak and read it. Outside of work, he has many hobbies like biking, photography, cooking, and 3D printing. And Pramodji, his father, is a retired structural optimization engineer with 30 years of experience in auto industry. He also loves reading history, traveling and hiking. And Pramodji lives in Detroit, Michigan. Together, they have traveled to many of the forts and places of interest from 17th and 18th century Maratha history, including Raigad, Purandar, Pratapgarh, Shaniwarwada, Parvati Hill in Pune. And our flyer basically shows one of those beautiful pictures by the family. So thank you and very warm welcome to you. Rohan, I request you to please begin your part two of the third battle of Panipat. Thank you.
Excellent. Namaskar, everyone, and thank you for that great introduction. Chetan, thank you to the MMC, to the Itihas Manch organization. This is a great opportunity and platform for me to kind of share my learnings of history. So I'm very grateful for that. So I will share my screen and we can get started. Just start my own timer so I know how long I'm going. Great. Okay. So, as has been noted, this is a presentation on the Third Battle of Panipat, Part 2. In the first part, 2 weeks ago, we covered the 50-odd years of history leading up to this historic, chaotic, destructive Third Battle of Panipat, one of the biggest battles of the 18th century, with upwards of 100,000 lives being lost across both sides. And yes, it took place on January 14th of 1761. So not too long ago when you think of, how far into the past that our history stretches. And as we will discuss and has been hinted at, the outcome of this battle still is reverberating through our current society and has implications that we are still dealing with. So it's worth studying for just the sheer number of lives lost, the sacrifices made, as well as the impact into today's politics. And one cryptic message that kind of made its way off the battlefield once the result was decided was the following, and it's kind of haunting, and we'll dig deeper into the meaning later on, but it's just something to chew on for now that can keep us engaged as we go. And here's the quotation, the message. 2 pearls have been dissolved. 27 gold coins have been lost. And of the silver and copper, the total cannot be cast up. So dramatic reading aside, this is not a victorious message. This is a message of great loss and tragedy untold. And so we will dig into how it got to this point. And yeah, let's dig into it. The greatest battle of the 18th century. So one way to look at this battle is just the massive scale, as we've kind of hinted at. And one resource that Chetan actually pointed me at, and it's maybe the most famous drawing of the Battle of Panipat, is from just less than 10 years afterwards by an anonymous artist in this Faizabad style drawing of the Third Battle of Panipat. And if I use my laser pointer here, it's quite low resolution. This is really housed at the British Museum, but this is, believe it or not, the best copy available on the internet. But if you can follow my laser here, you can kind of see the main schism in the middle that defines the battlefield and the battle lines between the Marathas and the Afghans. And of course, the artist here has taken some artistic liberties, but it's still breathtaking in its portrayal of the scale. And if it's not clear here, these kind of tubes are the cannon tubes. and all of the smoke and clouds in the middle are the gunpowder exploding. And there are actually many, many details, more than we have time to dig into in this short presentation. But one, you can see here a figure kind of preserved in better color than the rest. This is a red figure on a brown horse, and that is Ahmad Shah Abdali himself. And on the opposing side, we have many of his officers, many of the Maratha officers, and we'll look into a zoomed in view on the next slide. But this is just to give you a primer for the massive scale that this battle was fought at and depicted not too long by its contemporaries after the fact. And as a fun fact, a primer, Panipat was actually one of the 5 towns that Sri Krishna asked the Kauravas to give back to the Pandavas to avoid the Mahabharata war. So it's a very ancient town. And there's a lot of history here, even before the first, second, and now third battles of Panipat. So yeah, we mentioned this zoomed in portion. This is Ahmad Shah Abdali, and he is, in kind of a victorious pose. On the right here is one of the Maratha commanders. We won't name him for now, but he is not doing so well. He's been injured potentially, and he's being helped by his, subordinates. But as we said, this is not a drawing by somebody who was at the Third Battle of Panipat, but was using kind of firsthand sources to draw from. So in the first part of the presentation, we covered, like I said, about 50 years of history. And I'm not going to do that again. I won't subject you to that. But I would like to just do a recap of the cast of characters to remind you of the players involved. So the big bosses, let's start. On the Maratha side, you have Nana Sahib Peshwa. And he is the son of the famed Bajirao Peshwa, as we said, and he had big shoes to fill, but he's doing a pretty good job. He's the prime minister of the Maratha Empire, and he's based out of Pune. He's a talented administrator and statesman, and the man who actually developed Pune as we know it. And even though he's known more for his administration, he is a competent commander when called upon. And leading up the Afghan side, we have the king himself, Ahmad Shah Durrani. He was a former foot soldier in the army of Iran's Nadir Shah. And he actually visited Delhi as a part of this invasion, and he was impressed by the riches that he saw. And so later, once he was out from under the thumb of Iran, he actually became a Afghan king, and he founded the actual modern state of Afghanistan. So he's considered a great uniter and national hero to them. And at the time of the Third Battle of Panipat, he had just been victorious in the civil war at home in Afghanistan, where you had these continuously warring tribes, and he was able to unify and pacify them to some degree. And generally speaking, Abdali, Durrani, you'll hear both names. He was noted for his military acumen and battlefield leadership. And the sheer number of battles that Abdali fought is frankly mind-boggling. And it's a great example of iron sharpening iron. And he really was a great commander, even if he's not the hero of the story from the Maratha perspective. So continuing with the cast of characters, on the Maratha side, the uncle and nephew duo, Sadashiv Rao Bhau. Now at this time, he's actually the commander of the Maratha army that's being sent north to check Abdali's constant interference, looting, and violent raids. And at this time, he's about 30 years of age. He is short-tempered, he's a straight arrow, and he's not quite cunning enough. He is a straight shooter, for better or worse. However, he is an advocate of Swarajya, that is the concept of India for Indians, and he does have a deep sense of morality and rightness. And just before this time, as we'd mentioned in the last presentation, he was victorious as a Maratha commander at Udgir, facing the Nizam, and he actually adopted their French-trained Gardi artillery force, and he was planning on using it against Abdali once he got up north. And while he was very accomplished and intelligent, he was lacking experience with the northern political situation. That'll cause problems later. But as a visionary, and he is a visionary, he foresaw the need for this superior French artillery to fight in the plains of northern India, which is an environment unlike where the Maratha Empire under Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj kind of got its start, doing Gani Mikawa style warfare in the more mountainous regions. And so, yes, heading up the duo is his nephew, Vishwas Rao. He is the eldest son of the aforementioned Nana Sahib Peshwa, and he's just 19 years of age. And he's considered to be the most handsome man in India at this time, kind of a shining jewel at the forefront of the Maratha Empire, if you will. And he was sent to gain battlefield experience and credit over what, by all accounts, was going to be a presumed total and easy victory over Abdali with the class of force that they were sending. And while his father, Nana Sahib Peshwa, may have wanted him to kind of check Pau's growing influence, Vishwas Rao and Sadashiv Rao Pau, they actually had a very close relationship, and there was no animosity or kind of competitive aspect there. And this is kind of showcased in a letter that Vishwas Rao wrote to his father. He said, "You will get many sons like me, but you will not get a brother like Pau." And now we come back to our unlikely collaborators on the Maratha and the Afghan side. They're kind of counterparts, if you will recall. We have Nazib Daulah Khan, and he is a Rohilla leader. The Rohillas, to be reminding you, are the Afghan soldiers of fortune who had kind of made their way to India and settled down in this region called Rohilkhand. And yeah, so Nazib Khan, he's a Rohilla king in his own right. And he has been inviting Abdali desperately, with all of the clout he can muster, to come and fight the Marathas, because he perceives them to be an existential threat, not just against the Rohillas, but against Islam itself in India. And like Abdali, he's a uniter. He has united many of these Rohilla Afghan chiefs to his cause. And of course, Abdali is the easy to label bad guy in this story. But if you really want to identify the main ideological antagonist of the Marathas, it's got to be Nazib Khan. He is the one who wants to see them wiped off of the northern political scene in a way that even Abdali doesn't necessarily initially care about. He's more of a money man. He wants to get paid. And Nazib Khan is driven more by extremism and ideology. And as we'll see, he's going to persuade Shuja-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Awadh, to join forces against the Marathas. And this is going to be a big problem. And the reason that these two characters are on the same slide is that he has an inexplicable special relationship as the adopted son of the character on the right, Malhar Rao Horkar, who is a high-level Maratha commander. Very puzzling, but it's going to come as a big part of the story later. It's going to become relevant. And so he led the center flank of the Afghan coalition army during the Panipat battle. So he is a big player, and he has a lot of skin in the game. So Malhar Rao Horkar, he's the Maratha commander in this case, and he is actually kind of from the old guard. Bajirao Peshwa himself had mentored Horkar into this battle-hardened commander that he was now. And of course, Bajirao is now dead, and his son Nana Sahib Peshwa is ruling from Pune, so it's kind of a different time, but that's the time that Horkar is from. And he has this philosophy of living to fight another day, also said as Sar Salamat to Pagri Pajas. If you survive, you can wear any hat. And yeah, he was a believer in Gani Mikawa. And this adoption of the French artillery strategy by Pau is going to cause him and Pau to kind of butt heads later, because Horkar is not really trusting this new age strategy. And to compound things, you have kind of an inter-service rivalry. You have the Horkars having bitter relations with another very powerful Maratha clan, which are the Shindes. And so they should be uniting against common enemies. And instead, they're often bickering and even coming to blows amongst themselves. And so he differed with Pau and Ibrahim Khan Gardi, naturally, about battle strategy. And he had a special relationship with Nazib Khan, and he treated him kind of as an adopted son or Manasputra, and he gave him special treatment that you would never give an opposing military commander in basically any situation. And now supporting actors who are still very important. We have our friend Shuja ud-Dawla, the son of Safdar Jung, the previous Nawab of Awad, but of course now Shuja has inherited that position, this very rich kingdom in the Dawab that was formerly under the thumb of the Mughals, but now in this weak Mughal period has kind of gained a power in its own right and richness. And he is, unlike many of the other people in his coalition on this side of the fight, he's a Shia Muslim, and he has family roots in Iran, which could cause friction with someone like Abdali, who is a Sunni Muslim, but we'll see how that dynamic plays out later. But overall, Shuja ud-Dawla truly is conflicted about choosing sides. He knows that this big battle is shaping up between the Marathas and the Afghans. He's conflicted, and he's going to have to choose. And lastly, he has ambitions. He has big ambitions. His father was one of the most powerful Mughal wazirs to ever be. And he is not that yet. He's the Nawab of Awad, but he still has ambitions to chase. And Ibrahim Khan Gardi, we mentioned, he trained as a commandant de la garde to Debussy, who is a future governor general at the French colony of Pondicherry. And he was employed by the Nizam at Hyderabad until his loss to the Marathas at Udgir. And at this time, he was offered employment by Bhau. And he said, sure, but he had conditions. He insisted on timely salaries, paid in cash for his troops, or there would be hell to pay, basically. But if you met his conditions, he was a very loyal commander. And as we will see, he will tragically be loyal to the Marathas till the end. And lastly, more Maratha commanders. These are two characters who we did not talk about in part one, so I'd like you to take special attention. But one is Govind Pant, and I put in quotations here, Bundele, we'll see why. He is kind of an elderly gentleman by the standards of the story. He is potentially between 55 and 60 years of age at this time, but he is a revenue officer who, kind of like Holkar, was appointed back in the old days by Bajirao Peshwa. And he started out with a force of 1,000, 2,000 cavalry. And as this war period would kind of ramp up, that force would grow to upwards of 5,000 cavalry. But he was never in charge of a large army. That's kind of something that will be crucial later on. But what's important is that Govind Pant, he operated in Bundelkhand, which is a region in the north, hence the nickname Bundele, but he was actually a Maratha man. So he was tasked by Bhau to win allies against Abdali, and eventually to even cut off Abdali's supplies flowing from the Dawab. So there's a lot contained in that sentence. Bhau is going to be asking and relying on Govind Pant Bundele quite a bit later in the story. So we'll need to keep attention on kind of his progress. And crucially, in the past, he had asked Nana Sahib Peshwa directly for funds to set up a permanent Maratha garrison with 20,000 cavalry, a real military force to be reckoned with in Bundelkhand, but to no avail. As we kind of mentioned at the end of the last presentation, this period of geographic expansion came with a lot of financial strains for the Marathas and the Peshwa in Pune. And so finances were almost certainly the reason why this force wasn't established. And lastly, we should discuss Barwantarao Mehendare. He, at this time, was the commander of the Huzurat. And the Huzurat, they were the Marathas and specifically the Peshwa's personal crack cavalry soldiers. They were the best of the best, and the fact that they were being sent up north to fight Abdali with Pau under his command was a big deal. So Barwantarao Mehendare, he was one of the best military leaders that the Marathas had. And he was additionally one of Pau's close advisors. And he's going to play a crucial role during the skirmishes leading up to the Panipat battle, when both of the armies are camped in these massive camps just a few miles from each other and are kind of testing each other's strength. That's when he's going to play a big role. And kind of as a fun fact, the Appa Barawan Tsauk in Pune is named after this brave warrior. Okay, thank you for bearing with me through this kind of recap of characters. Now the Great March begins. March 1760 is where our story picks back up. And I will kind of guide us through this map at the end of the slide, but I'll get through the contents first. So on March 7th, that's when Pao and Wishwas Rao, they depart from Patadur with 55,000 fighting troops and 100,000 non-combatants. I'd like to make a small note here that numbers in the ancient world are hard to analyze with modern standards. There's all sorts of reasons, they exaggerate numbers, and I just want to acknowledge that if you check 5 different sources, you'll get 5 different numbers. So forgive me if these are a little different than the numbers you're accustomed to. But this could roughly be broken down into, among these 55,000 fighting troops, you had 40,000 cavalry and then 15,000 infantry, and then these 200 shiny brand new French artillery pieces that were commanded by Ibrahim Khan Gardi. So on top of that, non-combatants, but still essential staff, we can say another 40,000 cooks, porters, water carriers, elephant handlers, horse grooms, blacksmiths, medical attendants, ammunition handlers. One thing I find fascinating about military history is the logistics, and that's why I've listed out all of these things, because it's just easy to forget what it takes to maintain such a massive force. But then you have maybe what can more accurately be described as actual dead weight. And this could be the Sardars' wives and children, household servants, and a big contingent in this case was Hindu pilgrims who were hoping to visit holy places like Mathura, Kashi, and others. And normally this, if you're talking about a military operation, you're not used to a huge civilian entourage like this. So why did they join? Why did Pao allow this sort of thing to occur? And the reason for that is morale and confidence was incredibly high. Like we said, this was assumed to be a revenge mission. This was kind of organized due to the shock of the death of Dattaji Shinde at the hands of Nazib Khan and Qutub Shah. So this is supposed to be the nuclear option. This is the button you press when you've been annoyed one too many times and you just want the problem to go away. So morale and confidence was incredibly high, and that's why you had this huge civilian contingent who felt safe traveling with this army into areas that are normally very unsafe. So steady progress was being made initially, 15 to 20 miles per day. And that's not bad, but it's going to slow up eventually. And Pao, he was kind of aware of the reputation the Marathas had gotten over the years, and he warned his forces against things like looting local villages. But as we're going to see with the kind of size of just mouths to feed that they had, they're going to have to do some questionable things later on in their campaign. And meanwhile, we'll discuss it more in the next slide, but meanwhile, while Pao is just getting started and heading north, Nazib Khan in the north has convinced Abdali for the first time to stay for the Indian summer. This is something Abdali has never done before. And that's actually another point I would like to touch upon, is that when Pao set off from Patadur, Raghunath Rao had done something similar a few years ago. And when Raghunath Rao got all the way north, he goes to Attock, or his forces reach Attock. Abdali is nowhere to be found. He's returned all the way to Afghanistan at that point. So it's not even a certainty that Pao and Wishwas Rao are going to run into Abdali. It might just be that they'll do a similar operation to last time, where they stamp out any small resistance or governors that he's put into place, and then it's business as usual again. So hindsight is 2020 is a phrase I like to say. It's easy to know what happened when you're looking backwards in time, because you have the advantage of knowing what happened. But these people really didn't know what they were getting into necessarily. And so from June to July of 1760, the slowdown really kind of becomes noticeable because at this time, the Marathas, they spend an entire month crossing this river, the Gambhir River. And it's not exactly a major river, but it is a river that had swollen during the monsoon. And it takes them a month to cross the Gambhir River. And just one kind of side note is that during this travel, it was estimated that Pau and their forces were traveling about 1/5 of the speed that someone like Bajirao Peshwa and his forces on horseback would have been traveling just 2 generations prior or 1 generation prior. So this kind of phenomenon of the wives and children of the officers tagging along, this can actually also be attributed to Bajirao Peshwa. He had married Mastani of Bundelkhand, and the culture was changing. So this dead weight, yes, morale and confidence was incredibly high, but there was also other reasons why officers' families were tagging along and things like that were happening. So yeah, this is going to be a sign of things to come. The Great March has begun, but they are running into stumbling blocks. So I will just do a little bit of laser pointing here. We had noted that Udgir, this is where Bhau had defeated the Nizam. And so Pune is all the way in the west over here. They don't go back to Pune to regroup. They have their war council at Batadur, and they go straight from there. They head north. They go to Burhanpur, they cross the Narmada, and they continue on their way north. You can see here it's labeled as Bhau's route. They pass through Gwalior. They stop by some, allied forts here with Suraj Mal Jat and Malhar al Horkar. That he has some interests in the area. And we're going to zoom into this section of the map, but really we can call the area around Delhi and maybe 100-kilometer radius around there the hot zone. This is also the area of the Dalab with the Yamuna and Ganga rivers, and the geography is really going to play a dynamic role. These rivers and the monsoon and the ability of either army to cross these rivers during the monsoon is going to play a large role in the outcome. So yeah, this is the map for now. All you really need to know is that Bhau may have been going quick enough in the south where there are not these massive rivers, but he's entering the hot zone and the rivers are just getting bigger and bigger. And the season is really progressing towards the monsoon time, which kind of peaks from July to September. So we talked about Bhau's Great March beginning. And what were the Afghans up to in this time? Well, you see, Nazib and Abdali, they were making chess moves from January to July of the same year, 1760. And here, as promised, is kind of a zoomed in view of the previous map, and we'll talk about it more. But just to give you some landmarks, this large black line, this is the Yamuna River. And on the right, you have the Ganga. And then in between, you have the Dalab and the kingdom of Awadh, which is Shuja-ud-Dawla's. You also have Rohilkhand here on the right. Nazibabad is Nazib Khan's capital. Delhi is, of course, the Mughal seat of power. So you have a lot going on here. But if you'd like something to look at while I'm talking, the dotted line that starts up here in the north and comes south and really winds its way around, crosses the Yamuna once, comes around to Jat territory, crosses the Yamuna again. So we can see just in general, Abdali is going to enjoy a lot more freedom of movement. And something we'd highlighted in the previous presentation is that, Abdali has crossed through the Punjab many times. And the Punjab is called the land of 5 rivers. So this is kind of telling you something, that the geography here is what Abdali is used to. This is also Nazib Khan's kind of home area. And the leader of the Marathas, specifically, Bhau, he has no experience here. He's never been here. And so the home court advantage is Nazib and even Abdali's, even though he's an outsider to this area. He's got some home players on his team. So let's talk about these chess moves that the Afghans are making. In January, Abdali, as he had done a few times, last time it was Nazib Khan, this time he appoints the cousin of his wazir, Yaqub Ali Khan, as governor of Delhi. And then 1 month later, in February, and we can kind of trace this here, Abdali at this point, this is in January, he enters Delhi, he appoints his governor, and then he's going to go on this little loop around here in Jat territory. He will make some threats. Like we said earlier, Abdali's the money man. He wants everyone to pay him. That is of primary importance to him. Afghanistan is a poor country. Delhi and India and this region are very rich. He's the money man. He wants to get paid. So he goes around, he makes some threats. And the Jat, he's a brave guy. He tells Abdali, hey, the Marathas are on the way. Until you beat the Marathas and maybe sit on the throne in Delhi yourself, I'm not paying you anything. So that kind of explains his little detour here. But now in February, Abdali, he's going to cross the Yamuna River from west to east here and set up camp in the Doab, near his fellow Rohilas or allied Rohilas, and actually even near Shuja-ud-Dowlah's territory, which is just by consequence close by. And he's going to stay there for some months while Pao is making his way north. And then in June, he will send Nazib Khan as an emissary to finally meet with Shuja-ud-Dowlah. And he wants Nazib to, by hook or crook, get him on their side and not on the Maratha side. And so Nazib Khan, we've kind of talked about, he's an ideological Islamic extremist. He believes in jihad against the Marathas. So he tries deploying this argument of Islam khatre mein hai, which is that Islam is in danger, specifically in India. This was Nazib Khan's truly held belief that if the Marathas were not pushed out of the north of India, then their whole Islamic religion was done, which was an unfounded belief, but it was one that he held. But that argument didn't really work on Shuja-ud-Dowlah. So he says, I'm not convinced. More weeks in June go by, and Nazib Khan meets with him again, and he escalates. He hands Shuja-ud-Dowlah a dagger, and he says, if you refuse to join, that's okay, but then behead me. I can't return to Abdali empty-handed. He was pulling out all of the dramatics, the charisma to get Shuja-ud-Dowlah on their side. And so finally, in July, a month later, with the Marathas nowhere in sight, frankly, the decision is made. Shuja-ud-Dowlah, he agrees that he will join Nazib, he'll join Abdali, and he travels for him not a very far distance to Anupshar, and that is where Abdali has been camped out in the Doab during this time. So he comes with some troops. He leaves most of his troops in his capital, though, as defense. He's not fully gung-ho about all this, but for now, he perceives the safest option is kind of to join the Abdali forces. And he is rewarded. We said that he had ambitions. He's rewarded by Abdali with the promise that once they win over the Marathas, he is going to be promised the position of the Mughal Wazir, which is a position he's always coveted. So, these are the result of the chess moves. Honestly, Abdali and Nazib are clearly good players because they have now, in a period of about 5 months, while the Marathas are making their way north, they've secured the crucial support of the Nawab of Awadh, while Pau is still hundreds of kilometers away and beyond the flooded Yamuna River. So we talked about the dotted line here and how Abdali is just kind of free to cross around. And he did a lot of these crossings before the monsoon time when it's still easier. But this is all occurring before this straight line, which represents Pau's path. Before he even comes up from the south, comes through Agra, passes through Mathura, and comes to Delhi. By that point, Abdali is already in the Doab, and the monsoon has come, and the Yamuna is uncrossable. So Pau's race to Delhi. So the Marathas were already late, like we said. The consequences of taking a month to cross the Gambhir, etc., meant that now that they were approaching Delhi, they wouldn't be able to cross the Yamuna. Its banks had overflown, and even Abdali couldn't cross it. And he's the river crossing expert. So they've got to stay put. Pau wanted to cross into the Doab and fight Abdali there, but that's not an option right now. And frankly, the Marathas, they're lacking experts in the pontoon bridge technology. So they decide they have to wait. But they haven't reached Delhi yet. So they continue on to Delhi. And during this time, we mentioned that Pau, he's nowhere near Shuja-ud-Dowlah yet, but he has an agent in the area. He has Govind Pant Bundele, the revenue collector. And so he was writing letters to Govind Pant. He said, go talk to Shuja-ud-Dowlah, secure him as an ally, promise him our support all of this. And we've talked about how the kingdom of Awad is very rich. Shuja-ud-Dawla has more than 20,000 troops and supplies and food, which will become very important that he can deploy to support whichever side. And so Govind Pant, he does go and talk to Shuja-ud-Dawla. He talks to the mother of Shuja-ud-Dawla, who is actually a supporter of the Marathas. But among other reasons, Nazib Khan's army and Abdali's armies are already in the Doab. They're at his doorstep. If Shuja-ud-Dawla, if he decides to stay neutral, that's one thing. But if he just decides to join the Marathas, he's done for. He's going to get attacked tomorrow. So he does the pragmatic thing and he joins the Afghans. So another thing that Pao had asked Govind Pant Bundele to do, which in my opinion really shows his kind of naivete about the North, given that this was his first time there. He wanted a bridge constructed on the Yamuna north of Delhi before he even arrived. He wanted Govind Pant Bundele to arrange this. And he was really being quite harsh in these letters, and possibly it's due to the fact that he didn't know the northern situation, but it's kind of clear in retrospect that he was expecting too much from this somewhat elderly gentleman who was commanding a limited force. And a fatal mistake here, which maybe won't change the battle of the outcome eventually, but it will lead to greater death and destruction after the battle, is that Porkar and Surajmal Jat, when Pao passes by Gwalher with his forces and the civilians and the entourage, Porkar and Jat, they say, hey, Pao, until the threat of Abdali is gone, all of these civilians who have come for religious pilgrimages, etc., we should leave them at this fort. This is kind of the last checkpoint of safety, and something maybe they weren't considering at the time, but these are more mouths to feed. And later on, if food becomes scarce, which it will, that's going to just accelerate the pace that they are sprinting towards starvation. So that's a big deal. And then late July comes, and Pao and his forces, they finally reach Delhi. He's ignored the advice, so they still have the civilians with them. But now, at least, we get to see some of Pao's visionary genius at work. Because now the Gardi cannons of Ibrahim Khan Gardi, they start to get put to work. And they are aimed at the walls of the Red Fort in Delhi. And remember, Abdali has put his man Yaqub Khan there. And he sees it's a foregone conclusion that this massive Maratha force has showed up. So he leaves the city and retreats. And Pao has a pretty easy time securing control of Delhi. And while they're there, they actually depose the Mughal emperor who had been installed by the kind of corrupt and dangerous Imad al-Mulk Wazir that we talked about. So they deposed the emperor Shah Alam III, who was kind of installed there previously. And so now, great. This has traditionally been a mark of success. If the Marathas can take Delhi, Delhi is the seat of power, right? So in some sense, it feels like the Marathas have won something, but have they? You see, now the Marathas, they're walking straight into a supply crisis, and this is going to cause Pao to look further north. And the time is now September 1760. And you see, in reaching Delhi, the Marathas are already out of money. Delhi has been stripped bare. Abdali has already been here in recent months. We know what he does when he comes to Delhi. And frankly, the city just can't sustain the massive Maratha camp for various reasons. The local population, the peasants, they don't like the Marathas. And it's like trying to squeeze blood from a stone. So there are not enough supplies here. The Marathas, they can't stay. And to make things worse, the Afghans and the Marathas, they're kind of staring at each other, not literally, but across the opposite banks of the flooded Yamuna River. So the Marathas know that their worst enemy is right there, but just some inconvenient natural monsoon conditions are preventing any kind of engagement from occurring. So they've got to worry about that we can't get distracted, because then the water level will rise and all of a sudden Abdali will be on top of us. So they're in a kind of tricky situation here. They don't have supplies, and the clock is ticking for when they're going to have to face their enemy. So while they're in Delhi, Govind Pant Bundele, he is actually the only Maratha contingent actually on the right side of the Yamuna at this time, the east side, and he is trying, but in vain, to cut off the Afghan supply lines that Abdali's kind of enjoying, coming from all over the Doab and now from Shuja'ud-Dawla's supply stores as well. So how he looks north, specifically, he looks 120 kilometers north of Delhi. And there lies the Kunjapura fort. And this was built about 30 years prior, actually by Nazib Khan. And at this point, it was stockpiling grains, animal fodder, money, munitions, and other loot, which was specifically earmarked by Abdali. He considered this loot his. It was for his return to Afghanistan. We mentioned how Abdali had stayed for the Indian summer for the first time. Before he left, whatever happened here, battle or no battle, plan was for Abdali to go to Kunjapura, get all his loot so that he could sustain himself and enrich himself ultimately when he returned to Afghanistan. So for the Marathas, this is now looking like a tasty treat. They can sustain themselves and they can kind of spit in Abdali's face a little bit while he's on the other side of the Yamuna. And I'm going to call this a miscalculation, but we'll see why it may not have been that way necessarily. But it's a little bit of a miscalculation on Pau's part, because he's thinking the Yamuna is going to be uncrossable for either party for at least another month. And that's going to be enough time to attack Kunjapura, travel that 120 kilometers, and travel back in time to actually intercept Abdali's forces while they're crossing the river. That's now their new plan, is that if they can't cross, they know Abdali wants to cross at some point, so they'll catch him in the act, but they've got to be there when that time comes. And so this is the same map as the previous slide, but you can see they come to Delhi, and they have to stay on the west side of the Yamuna because it's monsoon, they can't cross, they don't have the technology. And so 120 kilometers north here, we see Kunjapura. And so they decide to go for it. They need the supplies and they head north. They're going to attack the defenders at Kunjapura. The Kunjapura Gambit. Tactical victory, but maybe a strategic blunder. So the Marathas, they marched north to Kunjapura fort, and they got news that Abdus Samad Khan and Qutub Shah, two of Abdali's close allies, were in fact hiding at that fort. And so this made the situation even more tempting. And so this resulted in, on October 17th, the Battle of Kunjapura. And kind of it showcased the genius of these artillery cannons, again, the Gardi cannons. And the fort was basically obliterated, and it was kind of further compounded because there were some Afghan forces outside, Rohilla forces outside, and they had to retreat inside. The gate was opened, and Marathas were able to follow them inside and storm the fort. And the 10,000 Afghans at this fort were either killed or scattered. And the Marathas, they got the supplies they were after. And further, the Shinde clan actually discovered Dattaji's war elephant Jawahar, who was found on the Kunjapura fort and had been taken actually at the Battle of Burari Ghat, where Dattaji was killed. So this was a nice increase in Maratha morale. And further, this important guy, this Rohilla Qutub Shah, he was captured alive. And he was actually the one who killed and beheaded Dattaji. And he was brought in front of Pau on an elephant, which is kind of an honorable place to be. So that made Pau very angry. So his anger actually overflowed, and he asked Qutub Shah why he killed Dattaji, and he got an unsatisfactory answer that his religion compelled him. And so he beheaded him. And this was against the advice. Once again, we're seeing kind of a pattern where Horkar and Shinde, they said, hey, Qutub Shah, he's a valuable bargaining chip. Abdali would want him alive, or he can provide us some wealth, some kind of exchange. But that opportunity was lost. Now, this is where the previous miscalculation on time, frankly, becomes fatal. And it's going to be a fatal detour. It's that after this overwhelming victory and resupply at Kunjapura, Pau entertains the idea that the entire camp is going to continue on to Kurukshetra, which is further to the northwest, for yet another religious ritual performing journey. And he believed there was enough time, that the crossing of the Yamuna was still impossible. However, and maybe it really did seem impossible, But something changes. Abdali's rage boils over. You see, he gets news of the disaster at Kunjapura, and this was his kind of nest egg, you can call it. This was his retirement plan to get back to Afghanistan, and it was all of the wealth that he'd gained from looting on this campaign in India, and he was enraged. And so he vows to cross the Yamuna at any cost. He says he will throw in entire elephants and make a bridge out of them if necessary. He is truly, off his rocker. And on October 25th, days after the battle at Kunjapura, Abdali, in fact, he does cross flooded Yamuna River at Bagpat with the help of a one Gulab Singh, who is one of the Gujars who we're not really sure his motivations for helping Abdali. It may have been fear, it may have been for profit or alliance. But Abdali gets help from a local, and he finds the exact place where it's shallow enough or there's a path to cross. Of course, he loses some maybe elephants and heavy artillery pieces in the process, but he crosses before the Marathas are any the wiser. And so now this news does reach Pau while they're still near Kurukshetra, and he is shocked, and he's forced to abandon, whatever religious pilgrimage they have planned. And so days pass, and it's early November, and both armies are racing towards each other. The Marathas are coming down from the north, headed south, and the Abdali forces, the Afghans, they of course crossed south of the Marathas, and they're now headed north along the Yamuna towards the Marathas. But they stop short a few miles close to Panipat. And at this point, Abdali cuts off all the supply lines to Delhi and all others headed south. And really, at this point, the civilization is more behind Abdali. It's closer to him. North of the Marathas is what you can call no man's land. And there's not really much there. And so there is a fundamental kind of geographic asymmetry between the resources now available to the Marathas and the Afghans. And so this moment of miscalculation has now locked in the positions that these armies are going to be starting in. And it's leading to a huge disadvantage for the Marathas. And so just a small aside for the Battle of Kunjapura, this picture on the right is actually from the more modern day of one of the remaining structures at Kunjapura. And the left is kind of an AI reconstruction of maybe what this siege and gate opening and kind of rush by the Marathas after the Afghans may have looked like at the time. And so now the noose tightens in the 2 months of November and December 1760. This should actually also say 1760. So the two armies are now on the same side of the Yamuna. They're facing each other. But Pau and Abdali, they understood the destructive potential of this looming battle and thus were wary to engage. Instead, a 2-month period of skirmishes ensued where both sides assessed each other's strengths and attempted to cut off each other's supply lines. That's just a universally good strategy. It doesn't matter if you're a Maratha or an Afghan. If you don't have to fight your enemy, if you can starve them instead, that's always a great plan. Or you can negotiate some better position from that point. As we said, the Marathas, they were inhabiting kind of a no man's land. There was nothing to the north of them that was economically valuable or would provide them supplies. Whereas the Afghans, they still now had their connection to the Doab. The monsoon was kind of subsiding, and now they were going to have no issues with Shuja-ud-Dawla sending them all sorts of supplies and food from the Doab. And to compound matters, in a tragedy for the Marathas, Govind Pant Bundele is killed by one Atai Khan in a disguised surprise attack, where Atai Khan's forces would actually raise the Zari Patka, like the Maratha flag. And he, being an elderly gentleman, he tried to actually mount his horse 3 times, and he failed, and he was struck down and killed before he could even mount his horse. And this put an end to the Maratha efforts to cut off the Afghan resupply. So now it was not even a fair fight. The Marathas had no ability outside of their main camp to kind of interfere with the Afghan resupply. And remember our Huzurat commander Barawantrao Mahendra, he's also killed in a skirmish, and he played an important role in this time in being very brave and leading these kind of expeditionary forces. But in one of these skirmishes, he's killed, and his widow insists on performing sati, and she takes her life despite Bau's pleas. And the loss of both of them now has devastated the Maratha morale, despite the fact that in the skirmish that took Barawantrao's life, numerically, the Marathas were actually better off. They inflicted more casualties and took fewer than the Afghans, but their beloved leader had been taken from them. And their young son was now an orphan, and he was entrusted to Bau's care. So this was really just a shock to the Maratha morale. And here you can see one of these would-be Maratha expeditionary forces taking a side route through some wooded area so that they can avoid the Afghan raiders and maybe come back with some supplies. It's a dark time. And this whole time, we should also mention the Marathas are starving. They have no supplies, so they are literally starving or getting to the point of being very hungry. And further, it's becoming wintertime, and they are not used to the cold climate that's standard in this area of Panipat, whereas the Afghans, they're used to these intense winters, and they actually didn't like, this was the reason it was the first time they'd stayed for the Indian summer. It was because they don't like the Indian summer. It's too hot, it's too humid. They even get diseases that they're not used to. So this leads to January of 1761, days from what will be the actual date of the battle, and desperate final attempts to avert war. So we mentioned that to the north of the Marathas, there was not really much going on, but the Sikhs, they were kind of active in the area, but they remained neutral. They were not ideologically joining themselves at the hip with the Marathas. They were not saying, your victory is our victory, your loss is our loss. This was strictly transactional relationship. It was cash for supplies and cash only, not credit. And this was very detrimental. You can't say it was unfair. The Sikhs didn't know who was going to win this battle. They didn't know if the Marathas' credit would be good tomorrow. And the Marathas in the past had not done enough work to actually form a meaningful relationship with the Sikhs. And ironically, negotiations between the Marathas and the Afghans, it would actually deadlock over the status of Punjab. And Bhau basically would not concede Punjab to Abdali, and that was Abdali's non-negotiable point. Bhau felt that Raghunath Rao previously, he didn't have to do that. He was able to reconquer Punjab, and he was not about to accomplish less than Raghunath Rao. So you could say it was out of pride, but also reasonably, why would you cede something to this outside invader? So Bhau would not concede. And while maybe Abdali was willing to settle on some sort of agreement, Nazib Khan insisted on jihad against the Kafir Marathas. He was never in this for extracting money or getting Punjab. He was in this to, in his eyes, save Islam in North India and really to preserve their dominance is how he saw it. So all the time that this was happening, Maratha morale was being further sapped as supplies were exhausted, horses died, and starvation loomed. And the Marathas, they couldn't go far for supplies due to the constant Afghan raiding parties that would be looking out for them. And it should be noted, these skirmishes, if it weren't for the battle that's going to take place soon, these skirmishes would be large battles in their own right. In some nights, upwards of 3,000 to 5,000 combatants will die in a skirmish. So that just tells you the scale of the operations occurring here. And additionally, the Marathas, they weren't accustomed to this cold weather. It really took an impact on them. And finally, this is kind of an occurrence that is the straw that breaks the camel's back. On January 6th, the Marathas, they're supposed to get a cash infusion from Delhi. And this Maratha expeditionary force, they're transporting this treasury from Delhi. Supposedly, they're walking back to the camp. And unbeknownst to them, the Abdali camp had actually relocated in the interim period. They had moved a kilometer or so closer to the Yamuna River east. And so where the Marathas were expecting nothing, or maybe their own camp, they walked right into the Abdali camp and started speaking Marathi, thinking that they were in their home camp. And of course, they were quickly found out. And some survivors escaped, but the treasury was lost. And this was their last attempt to kind of avoid starvation. And Howe's commanders told him at this point, please don't let us die this dishonorable death of starving here. Let us fight. We'll gladly fight and die if needed. And so they host kind of a last minute commanders planning meeting. And Hao and Ibrahim Khan Gardi, they're disagreeing with Horkar's plan, but they override him and they say, we are going to do our artillery plan. And actually, they don't want to fight. They want to form a square, have the artillery shooting cannons from the front, and they want to, if possible, just slide past the Afghans. They want to avoid them completely. They want to head south. The Afghans eventually want to head north. And so Howe's plan is, let's make a defensive maneuver to break through the Afghan siege as he sees it and go towards Delhi along the Yamuna. This will be clearer in the diagram that we have. So here's the diagram of that day of reckoning on January 14th, 1761. This is a fantastic diagram, maybe one of the most valuable depictions in the Solstice at Panipat book. So I may come back to it. Feel free to take a screenshot, or on the YouTube later, you can pause and inspect it closer. But this is a map of basically all of the major combatants on the Maratha side. They're listed out on the left, and they are along the top line here. And on the right, you have all of the Afghan combatants and flanks labeled, and they're kind of on the bottom. And to explain this map, this is up is north. You have the Yamuna River on the right here. So think of it as an extremely zoomed in version of the map we've kind of been looking at. And you can see that the Maratha camp was set up in the shape of kind of a circle here, and Abdali's camp had been placed back here. And so the Marathas, like we said, they said, we don't want to fight and destroy Abdali's forces at this point. Instead, they are going to form this kind of square formation. They're going to move to the east. And then once they've cleared the right flank of Abdali's forces, they're now going to move south. They want to break through where you see these lightning bolts, what they have to, fight through just as little as they have to break free of the Afghan forces, and then break away to the south. That's how desperate they are at this point. But they think they have a viable plan. So just to, I've color-coded some of the positions here to show you things that will become relevant later in their setup. Let's start with the Marathas, perhaps. So one thing is their leadership style. So you see the third box here is in orange. This is Huzuratan Barobar Bhau Vishwas Rao Ani Samasher Bahadur Chi Khas Paga Yashwant Rao Pawar Ani Antaji Mankeshwar. So yeah, we have Bhau and Vishwas Rao front and center. They're both sitting on elephants at the leading edge center flank of their formation. That's just something to note. Meanwhile, in green here, with the labels of 14 and 15, you have Abdali Chi Chawani and Abdali Chi Gulam Paltan. So kind of Abdali's personal camp and his personal slave army that he had. And then the A, Swataha Abdali. The A, it's kind of a little difficult to see, but it's here. And you'll note it's behind the line. So this is a crucial difference. And it's something that Bhau will criticize Abdali for. He'll call him Namarda, basically not a man, for not sitting at or fighting at the front of your troops, from horseback or elephant back. He'll call him Namarda for this, but it's going to be something that will be incredibly important, is that Abdali, he's an experienced general and he's not a coward. That's not why he's standing back here. But it was maybe a limitation of the Marathas' understanding of military techniques at the time. And just a note, leading up the center of the Abdali flank, then you have his Wazir, Shahi Wazir Shah Wali Khan. And now one thing that will become important later, and it'll be the only maybe kind of comfortable light point in the Marathas' ending to the story. Keep note of this yellow box, which is the forces of Malhar Rao Holkar. And then kind of directly across from them, you'll see this brown box, which is the forces of Nazib Khan. So whether by coincidence or not, these two opposite side commanders who have this special father-son relationship are going to end up facing each other. So just keep an eye on them. Let's see if they actually fight, if they show each other some deference. But this is the setup. This is the key to this whole presentation. If you don't want to waste a whole hour watching this, just come back to this slide, and this will teach you everything you need to know. So now let's go through the fatal day of the battle, the deployment, dawn to 9 a.m. So the Marathas' organization, the Gardi artillery made up the left flank. Bhau and Vishwas Rao were on elephants, leading the Huzurat, the cavalry, in the center flank, while Shinde and Holkar's troops made up the right flank. And the Afghans, their center flank was led by the Afghan Wazir Shah Wali Khan, and Abdali himself was commanding from a hilltop in the rear with binoculars. So not just was he in the back, commanding his troops, he was doing so with kind of the advanced technological tools at the time. He had binoculars, incredibly rare tools that gave him the edge over his opponents. And as we stated, Holkar, he opposed this idea of this frontal assault, even if it was supposed to be a means to an end. And he would later claim, actually, as we'll see, his actions might require him to defend himself. He'll claim that Bhau had asked him to evacuate the women, the children, the non-combatants in the case of imminent defeat. And we'll see that he does something to that effect later. And a crucial detail here is the Marathas, they had no reserve troops held back. This is something that we take for granted in modern militaries where, you have your front line of troops, but then you have multiple layers of lines behind them. This concept was not really fielded by the Marathas in this battle. So they had nothing held back, whereas the Afghans did. It was an all or nothing gamble to punch through the Afghan lines and continue south. And now the Maratha surge from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Things are going great. Things are going according to plan for the Marathas. You see, the Gardi French artillery, just like the previous two occurrences we saw at the Lal Killa, at the Kunjapura fort, it was devastating, in this case, to the Afghan left and center flanks, which were the first flanks that were encountered in that map that we saw. For 3 hours, they were cutting through them like a knife through butter, just as Bhau had envisioned. And the whole time the square was moving, albeit slowly. You have to remember, it was crucial to the Maratha strategy to be moving constantly. And that meant staying linked closely together to your next neighboring flank. And at this point, Afghan morale was collapsing quickly. If something didn't change, this was going to be an Afghan loss through and through. However, the Huzarat cavalry, naturally horses are going to be faster than something like heavy cannons. They surged ahead, and initially this sounds like a good thing. They're going to break completely through the Afghan center. And this sounds shocking, but apparently it's true. Shah Wali Khan, he will sit on the ground and begin eating dirt and crying in despair at just the abject pounding that is being handed to him by these powerful cannons. And he tells his now fleeing Afghan soldiers, who are now starting to rout and turn around and run, he says, Kabul is far away, as in, what are you doing? Stand and fight. You're not going to run 3,000 miles away to Afghanistan. However, Abdali, he is a prepared commander. He knows that this could be the end. And so he is preparing for a plan B. And he's even ordering his harem and his slaves to be loaded onto camels for a retreat, just in case, to see if they can make a desperate break north and maybe make it back to Afghanistan safely, and the Marathas won't pursue them. And now you start to see flaws in the Maratha mobility. And for a starter, we said the Huzarat cavalry surged ahead. We'll talk about that more next. But in addition, Holkar and Shinde's right flank begins to lag. It fails to advance. And this gives the Afghans time to regroup. Instead of that contact constantly pushing them back, now the Afghans had a chance to regroup. And so now This is a random event and a good luck event for the Afghans. But as we say sometimes, luck is just preparation meeting opportunity. And the Marathas had been handed many, many opportunities in different ways that they could have approached this moment. And for one reason or another, fate hands the Afghans a moment of good luck. And around 1 p.m., a stray bullet strikes and kills Vishwas Rao, the 19-year-old most handsome man in India, son of Nana Sahib Peshwa and co-commander of the massive Maratha force. And he's seated atop an elephant, as you may remember, as you can see in this kind of photo. Now, Pao, he's next to him on another elephant, and he sees his nephew fall. He becomes incredibly distraught. He comes down from his own elephant. He abandons his howdah. He mounts his horse, and he vanishes into the thick of battle. He needs to make the enemy pay for what they've just done. And he's thinking with his heart, but he's not thinking with the head of a commander, and he's just made a grave mistake. You see, armies now, battlefields have changed. You don't always see your commander. But at this time in the 18th century, and especially for the Maratha army, for how they fought, if you don't see your commander on the battlefield, it basically means you've lost. And at this point, panic spreads like wildfire through all the ranks. And they are confused. They think, have both of our leaders fell? Maybe they saw Vishwas Rao fall. They said, hey, where's Pao now? Has he fallen as well? And they begin to turn and run. And a compounding issue, as we mentioned, the cavalry, they're fast and they're eager and they were winning. And they didn't want to cede credit necessarily to this new and fancy artillery. The Huzarat, they were the respected crack troops of the Peshwa, the highest honors in the Maratha Empire. And so they surged ahead, they pressed their advantage. But when they got so much ahead, 1 mile in front of their own artillery, in their line of fire, that coordination was lost. And Malhar Rao Holkar, kind of reading the signs and the panic that was emerging, he takes his troops and he retreats in a philosophy or in an action consistent with his philosophy of Shir Salamat Pagdi Pajas. So he intends on living to fight another day. He happens to be across from his Manas Putra, Nazib Khan, and he manages to slide away. And yeah, Nazib Khan let him pass by his flank, and the adopted father-son relationship is apparent again. And now this opens up the door for the Afghan counterstrike from 1 p.m. to sunset. Abdali saw an opportunity as the demoralized Marathas wavered, and he committed fresh reserve troops who now entered the fray. The Huzarat cavalry now faced the horror of camel-mounted mobile Jamburak gunners. And we'll have a picture of this on the next slide. You see, the Marathas, they weren't the only ones with the guns. They had big guns, but when it came to smaller mobile guns, the Afghans actually were reigning supreme at this time. You see, a big gun like Ibrahim Khan Gardi's, it takes many beasts of burden and minutes or hours to move or re-aim. But these camel-mounted guns were going everywhere and causing chaos. As we discussed, the Gardi artillery, they stopped firing to avoid hitting their own advancing cavalry and doing friendly fire. And they were defenseless then when the Afghan waves fell upon them. It's not very helpful to have a long-range cannon when your opponent is 10 feet away from you holding a sword. So that was, they were slaughtered basically. And so Pao, he takes his last stand and he's fighting in hand-to-hand combat. And eventually he too falls at a tree that becomes called the Kala Amb. And it's a mango tree that became stained black in legend due to how much blood was shed upon it. And without going into excessive gory detail, by sunset, it's a complete rout. There are an estimated 40,000 Maratha soldiers dead and an estimated 20,000 Afghans dead or more. And that's the non-combatants are not included in this total yet, as they were captured, and the next few days would be crucial for their fate, as they were to be sold into slavery or worse. And this is just one illustration. Actually, my Baba was able to take this at the Parvati Museum just on top of the Parvati Hill in Pune just a few days ago. So this is a kind of drawing of what the Jamburak Afghan camel-mounted cannon looks like, which is very funny. I think it almost looks like a comic book, but it would be a very dangerous and formidable weapon if you were faced with it. So now the day of the battle is over. Let's talk about the aftermath and 3 days of horror in Panipat. So a massacre occurs basically continuously for 3 days afterwards, from January 15th to the 17th. 40,000 unarmed Maratha civilian prisoners were executed in 3 days, and it was all sanctioned by Abdali. Women and children were enslaved to be sold off in Balochistan, Afghan camps, and Kabul markets at the whims of the Afghan soldiers. The streets of Panipat literally are running red. Human heads are piled up into several minars or towers. And the cryptic message that we began with somehow sneaks its way off the battlefield and makes its way to Pune, to the Peshwa. And he gets the message: 2 diamonds, 27 gold coins, unlimited silver and copper lost. The 2 diamonds being the commanders, Bhau and Vishwas Rao, the gold coins being their top commanders, and so on and so forth. And here's another picture that my Baba was able to take a few days ago, also from the Parvati hilltop, and it lists many of the Sardars and soldiers that were killed at Panipat. And to recap some of these fallen Maratha heroes, Sadashiv Rao Bhau, our kind of main character in this latest push north, he died fighting in hand-to-hand combat after his nephew's death. And he kind of felt that he was a very prideful man. He couldn't show his face to Nana Sahib Peshwa after the death of his nephew, who he had sworn to protect. And so, obviously we can't ask him any questions, as he only lived for a very short time after watching his nephew die. But he must have felt that there was no point in going on living, as he'd failed at protecting his nephew. And of course, Vishwas Rao himself, the heir to the Peshwa throne, was now no more. Ibrahim Khan Gardi, the artillery chief, he was captured, and recognizing his skills, he was also offered employment by Abdali, which he refused out of loyalty to the Marathas, and he was also executed. Jankoji Shinde, at this point the now head of the Shinde clan, he was wounded, captured, and also ultimately executed. And the total losses, as we said, 40,000 soldiers, 40,000 civilians, and 20,000 Maratha prisoners were to be taken back to Afghanistan or otherwise to be sold into slavery. The long road home. There are 2 homes, one for the victors. The victors depart. A few months later, on March 25th of 1761, Abdali leaves Delhi for Kabul for the last time. And he, in fact, actually keeps the Mughal emperor in place that had been appointed by the Marathas, and he never again returned to Delhi. And now, while the Sikhs, they were not necessarily, part of the Maratha coalition, they were no friends of the Afghans, and they, in fact, had been fighting with the Afghans for many years. And so they harassed the Afghan caravans that were passing through the Punjab, and they managed to rescue some Maratha women and slaves that would have otherwise ended up in Kabul. A large number of these prisoners were offered as slaves to tribal chiefs en route through Balochistan, and you end up with some of these kind of modern Maratha groups that are still seen today and preserving the traditions. And Abdali even sent a letter to the Peshwa praising Maratha valor despite the Afghan victory. And the Maratha heartbreak. You see, one thing that we didn't touch on too much is that for about a year or more at this point, the Peshwa, Nana Sahib Peshwa, he's had tuberculosis, and he, for various reasons, hadn't gripped the full gravity of the situation, even in sending Pau to the north and the final stages before the battle. We didn't touch on this, but he was really ignorant to how dire the situation was. Pau did not, maybe for reasons of pride, give him a depiction of how desperate things were. So when the Peshwa does get the news that his son has died, Pau has died, and the whole army is lost, then he dies both of TB, but also a broken heart, you can say, at the Parvati Hill in Pune in June. And another kind of group, the Road Marathas, they settle in Haryana, never to return home, and they preserve traditions to this day. And here's a picture of some of them today with this monument at the Panipat se Kala Am Ye Til Smarak. They've made a monument where that mango tree that Bhau is supposed to have died near is located. And the next Peshwa ends up being the brother of Vishwas Rao, Madhav Rao Peshwa. And he's just 16 years of age, and he inherits this mauled and badly bruised Maratha empire. And additionally, the Marathas, while they're focused on rebuilding, a power vacuum kind of reforms in the north of India and Bengal, and the British are soon after this time, and actually I guess a few years before in one case, able to get a foothold in the battles of Plassey and Buxar against the weakened Siraj ud Dawla, who's in charge of Bengal at this time, who maybe wouldn't have follied had the Marathas come and put some strong leadership there. However, eventually there will be a resurrection, just in 10 years' time. The young Madhav Rao Peshwa, he manages to rebuild, despite domestic challenges with his uncle Raghunath Rao, Rakhoba, but that's a story for another time. Mahadaji Shinde, also of the Shinde clan, who was wounded at Panipat, later emerged as the preeminent northern commander for the Marathas. And then in 1771, 10 years later, the Marathas retook Delhi, just 10 years after this major loss. And now the Rajput, Rohilla, and Jat rulers were brought back under Maratha authority. Abdali died of really disfiguring throat and nose cancer about 10 years after the Panipat battle. And the ultimate cost would be that even though this recovery occurred, the spirit of expansion and the absolute limit of expansion was halted. They never went past Attock, past the Raghunath Rao expedition. They lost an entire generation of top warrior leaders, political talent. So a great cost was paid. And the vision of Hindavi Swarajya, of self-governance, temporarily faltered. Confederacy was weakened. There was internal strife, and specifically the leadership had some issues that they probably wouldn't have had without these great losses. And the British East India Company will fill in some of these power vacuums. So the big what if, the big takeaway is that the Maratha win at Panipat, had it occurred, could have prevented colonization entirely and established pan-India unification under these, democratic and progressive leaders. So it's a big what if, and history doesn't repeat itself, or we don't get a second chance, but we can learn from some of these lessons. So these lessons are specifically about military failures. You can't adopt new technology without proper integration. The French artillery, it was very powerful, but it wasn't seamlessly integrated with the Maratha cavalry. They didn't practice. The exposure of your leadership. Bhau and Vishwas Rao were on elephant howdahs versus Abdali in the back on a hill with binoculars. That's a very different level of vulnerability. Having reserve troops or not, have you deployed everything? Then you have fewer options. Logistics are everything. Bhau, out of pride, brought almost 100,000 non-combatants, and then they were cut off from supplies. They dealt with colder than anticipated weather and starvation, and refusing maybe common sense actions like dropping off the civilians at a fort until the main threat had been kind of addressed. And then there are also political failures that can be learned from. Failed diplomacy. The Marathas, as we stated, were not the best at winning over allies who naturally should have been in their court, like the Rajputs, the Jats, Sikhs. Internal conflicts, inter-service rivalry, as I called it. The Horkars and the Shindes were too busy bickering to worry about common threats. And, there was debate on whether this artillery business was even effective. So they didn't have unity on a certain level. Subpar intelligence. Bhau was unaware of northern politics, as we talked about. And he was also a hardliner who often failed at diplomacy and kind of lacked the cunning required for diplomacy. And this critical pontoon bridge development, was arguably a political failure to not see the importance of this or at least see that your enemies are outclassing you in these capabilities. And that led to the inability to cross and attack Abdali on their own terms. And finally, the Shuja decision. Losing Awad's support, in hindsight, really sealed the Maratha fate, because any war in modern times, and this was arguably maybe the beginning of some form of modern warfare, which makes it so interesting, and led to some of the huge death numbers and tragedies as a result. But this idea of logistics becoming supremely important. In hindsight, we have the benefit of knowing what happened. It may have been what sealed the Maratha fate. Okay, thank you very much for listening for so long. I talked a lot. This was the third battle of Panipat. This is the end. Thank you for listening. And I'm now glad to maybe have a group discussion, field any questions, and just talk about it further. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rohan. It was like really a grand series, 2 parts. Actually, I felt you had a lot of content and we squeezed into actually 2 sessions, and it's kind of a bit unfair to you. But we should look at something broader series for the future. Excellent series, lot of details, contemporary evidence is quoted, beautiful pictures, some old paintings, vintage value, as well as equally beautiful AI generated pictures by yourself. It was very creative. It adds a lot of character to the speech, and it kind of creates that it helps with the story narration, and it creates that image of the battle itself, like you get the real feel of it. So it adds a lot of shivers, and beautifully presented, very well articulated, extremely nicely organized from start to end. It's a very well organized. Every detail, every slide was beautiful, fantastic job. I can't thank you enough. It was very well delivered. Thank you.
Great job, Rohan.
Yeah. And I wanted to thank the audience also. Thank you for your time and staying on this, and encouraging our young speaker, and he's very brilliant in the job. And so that's very appreciated. Thank you, Maharashtra Mundal, as well as some new audience members also. But I wanted to thank a few EC members also, Namita Tai, for all the great support throughout the year. And Manoj Dada, for a very short notice, he came upon request and he did the YouTube live for us. So thank you, Manoj Dada. And also thank you, Archana Shripal, and Arundhati Zadhav, and the Shala team, which also presented this slides and Zoom information on other MMC groups. So thank you so much for everyone's support. Obviously the Itihas Manch team and Thanedar family. So thank you so much. Do we have any questions? So we can take the questions. Subhash Kaka, yes, please.
Thanks, Rohan. It was excellent. The most presentations I heard so far on Panipat by Maharashtrian colleagues, they tend to get very emotional about the presentations and don't stay very objective at times. And I'm glad you stayed very objective. You stated the facts as they were and pointed out both the pros and cons, or the shortcomings, or the benefits, or whatever. So I applaud you for doing that. I think that was very helpful in understanding the situation. Because I heard bits and pieces of Panipat stories from different speakers, but they don't all go into the backgrounds and the various players involved in it. Just one quick question is, you mentioned that Marathas were late in getting there for various reasons, for logistics reasons. What was the original timetable? I mean, did they have is there any record of when they were really hoping to be there and fight Ahmad Shah Abdali? Because the weather was against them at the end, but they probably didn't plan for it. So what was the original plan in your
Yeah,
case?
yeah. I think first of all, yeah, thank you for the praise. I definitely strive to be objective in my analysis. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. Um, this is a great question. What was the intended timetable or desired timetable? I think really the one is I'll truthfully say I don't know off the top of my head, or I may not remember if Bhau had a goal in mind that he'd like to be in Delhi, before the monsoon began. But I think a couple of factors play into this. One, we now know that there was the final face-off between Bhau and Abdali. The big battle did occur, but we have the